Okay, great. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for the introduction, and thank you everybody who's here for coming and spending a little time thinking about how climate change might be influencing mammals on mountains. Specifically, today we'll talk about Colorado mountains, but this applies to mountains around the world, as I'll mention as we go through. So essentially today we have a few minutes. I'll probably talk about 40 minutes about what we've been finding for how mammals in Colorado are responding to climate change. And then there'll be time, as Suzanne mentioned, to answer your questions. So I can't cover everything in that amount of time. So if you do have questions that come up, just put your questions in that Q&A and then we'll try to get to as many as possible. All right, so as I said, Colorado mammals and climate change. So I'll first start out with a little background story here. So why am I interested in this in the first place? Well, like many people on this call, you probably grew up near mountains, and so did I. I didn't grow up next to the Rockies. I grew up next to the Sierra Nevadas in California. And in that, I became interested in just seeing animals around, fishing. My family was into fishing and hunting and skiing and backpacking. And that's where I became interested in biology in the first place, but also mountains specifically. And then after undergraduate, where I learned how to trap mammals, smaller mammals, and clean traps, the best part. As I transitioned to working, as Suzanne mentioned, I worked in the Peace Corps doing conservation in protected areas, which ended up being mostly about protecting water. And in Honduras, protecting water means protecting the mountains. And then after that, I worked in Costa Rica studying mammal distributions and their conservation in the Tiburon mountain range shown here. So from there, I was working in New Mexico at the University of New Mexico, and I was offered the job here in Colorado. And so I knew I would be working in Colorado. I hoped for a long time. And so in 2007, I started studying the mammals in Colorado mountains. And so I started in the San Juan Mountains, which for those of you who aren't familiar, they're in the southwest corner of the state. So the mountains closest to what we call the Four Corners. And these are really beautiful mountains. They encompass Telluride ski area, of course, and also on the lower slopes, Mesa Verde National Park. And that's where I started asking the question I'm posing to you today, which is, do you wonder how those mammals that you see on your hikes are being affected by the warming temperatures of climate change? And so that's what I started studying in 2007. And we've been studying in my lab for quite a few years now, so almost 13 or 14 years. And so that's what I'm going to present today, is what we know so far about how mammals are changing on mountains in Colorado. But first, I just wanted to give a little bit of overview about how climate is changing, both on mountains, but globally, and then specifically here in Colorado. So humans are changing our climate. On mountains, right, you can see this in various ways. In this picture, a researcher is showing a glacier in the mountains that historically was much larger distribution than it's seen today. And it's probably even smaller. This picture was taken in 2000. So the reasons for that is that temperature is warming, and temperature is warming globally. And that temperature change is then influencing the entire climate of the planet. So changing also how precipitation patterns, weather patterns, storm patterns are distributed around the world. And so here you can see that there's also been change for precipitation. So areas like where I worked in Honduras and Costa Rica, are getting drier, whereas other areas are getting wetter. Well, so the bottom line here is that temperature on the planet is going up. And you can see here, this is for the global means, that temperature each year goes up and down a little bit, but overall, the trajectory is one of warming. And you can see that most of this warming is perceived or is statistically documented to change from 1980s towards the present. That's when there was enough fossil fuels in the atmosphere to actually start warming the planet. And so humans are doing this to ourselves, right? So here's timeline on the x-axis from the 1880s to present, and then on our y-axis is the CO2 emissions from different sources listed here. And you can see that they started accumulating after industrialization, but in the 60s or so, we started going up exponentially about how much CO2 we were putting into the atmosphere. And once enough accumulated in the 1980s, we saw temperature change. And you can see that here with a longer timeline on the x-axis, but now in estimations of billions of tons. And you can just see how exponentially we're increasing how much CO2 we are putting into the atmosphere. And in Colorado, you can see that's also increased our temperature over time since the 1980s, really going an upward trajectory of a few degrees centigrade or Celsius, and then several degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so just to see how this changes across the planet, NASA put together a really nice global image of how temperature has changed since the 1880s. And so what you'll see here is that the blues are cools and warmer temperatures are in yellow, and really warm temperatures are in the reds. And remember that about 1980 is when we started to be able to detect climate change. So look for that at the bottom, and then you can see how much temperature has changed since the 1980s. Whoops, where did that go? Let's start that. All right, here we go. So all through here, little ups and downs, gets cooler, gets warmer, gets cooler, normal fluctuations. Then we're in the 60s, we start having a lot more CO2 accumulating, and now it starts to accumulate enough that temperature is really changing. Right, so here we are in a very warm world, much warmer than it was in the 1880s, but significantly warmer at the higher latitudes. So let's just watch that one more time so you can see the ups and downs before human-induced climate change, and then post-1980, see how warm it gets. All right, so that's what we're living in today. Temperatures have warmed on average about 2 degrees, but much higher in the higher latitudes where temperatures have warmed up to 5 degrees. And one of the most important takeaways here is that this is showing you how temperatures changed since across the history of the Earth. And black is temperatures, blues are showing you times when it was cooler and ice house conditions, and others where it's warmer, cold house conditions. But the key I want you to see is that the scale on the bottom here is in 5 million year increments. So things are going up and down, but the change that's occurring is over literally decades of millions of years. And then in this little panel, it's showing you the ice ages, which are in tens of thousands of years. And then
then we're jumping temperature way up here in the current years, which is occurring over years, right? So the main point I want to make with this slide, I know it's pretty complicated, but it's just the idea that we're changing temperature much, much faster than it has been changing in the evolutionary history or the whole history of the Earth. And so that's what's difficult for mammals that are trying to respond, or any organism, including humans in our agriculture, when we're trying to respond to how temperatures changing. It's changing really fast and unprecedentedly fast. And so if you are interested in more information about climate and explaining climate change, there's an excellent article that just came out today in the New York Times. So you might have to do a little search in the New York Times, but it's called The Science of Climate Change Explained, Facts, Evidence, and Proof. And it's really well written, gives you lots of places to go if you want to dig deeper. But overall, I hope I showed you that climate is indeed changing here in Colorado, and has changed on the mountains that we studied. Well, you might be asking, well, why is climate so important to these mammals? Well, for mammals and any organism, living organism, whether it's a bacteria, whether it's a human, or whether it is a rodent, a main determinant of where they live and flourish is climate. So we talk about a species niche. So that is the temperatures within which, and other things like precipitation and food resources and the habitats they live in and their predators and diseases. Each species has evolved to live within a circumscribed group of temperatures and precipitation, and their food resources also have evolved to live within particular climates. And so they are very much evolved to live in a particular set of climates that allows them to live and to reproduce successfully. And so that's why when we talk about climate change, that's why we predict temperature and precipitation and humidity and all of those things as they change to have a big impact on how species are succeeding in where they live today. All right, but we are going to talk mostly about climate change today, but we're also going to talk a little bit about other things that humans are doing to the planet, including deforestation, or in general habitat change, but that also includes where we live. And here's a picture of beautiful Boulder, but we are taking up habitat where mammals used to live. So keep in mind today, we're talking about climate change, but it's also embedded in how we're changing the land as well. All right, so back to our question. 2007, I asked, well, I wanted to start to assess how are Colorado mammals being affected by these warming temperatures that we know are being experienced? And so the first question then is, how do you measure how a mammal might be changing due to climate change? Well, one way you could do that is to have data for a mammal's population. So here's moose populations on Isle Royale in Michigan across time. So ideally, we would have great data for every mammal in Colorado and how their populations have gone up and down in relation to changing temperature. So here's some data for gray fox. You can see that gray fox across a time period have actually declined. And here's lemmings from the Arctic. Their populations have gone up and down over time, but now have started to plateau at a low level. So ideally, for all the mammals in Colorado that we're interested in, which I guess would be all of them, but that's a lot, right? So we actually have more than 100 mammals in Colorado. It's actually quite a diverse state for mammals. We have big mammals, including our iconic bison, American bison, which here in Colorado we call buffalo. But we also have a lot of smaller mammals, right?
And so each of those mammals, here's just showing you 3 ranges of prairie dogs. So here in the front range, we have the black-tailed, but there's 2 other species. So imagine trying to track every population over all of that time period to look for change in climate change. And it's just not possible, right? We just don't have either the resources or the time, and we also might not have that historical data. So one way to get around that is to try to build historical data sets for how mammals were distributed in particular mountains pre-climate change. So in this case, right, 1980, as I showed you. So historically, since the turn of the first turn, since the early 1800s, people have been studying mammals around the world, and in particular on mountains, because when you go up in elevation, you encounter lots of species. So here is Joseph Grinnell. He studied the mammals of Yosemite and lots of mountains around California. And similarly in Colorado, there were people out there using horses and mule trains and hiking and studying mammals. And they collected mammals from the early 1800s until now. And we still do this, not quite as many as they did in the past. But these were all put into museums. And here's me and Emily. This is our collection manager in vertebrates. And so these individual specimens are preserved in perpetuity in collections like we have at the CU Museum. And they each have a locality and an elevation that could be calculated from that locality to know where each species occurred before climate change. And then we can compare that to going out to those mountains and trapping, doing mark and recapture, studying their population sizes across those mountains, and compare that data from what we find today to what they found historically. And so that's in fact what we did. We built a really strong data set of historical specimen records. We georeferenced all of those and got elevations. So we know for each species where they occurred on each mountain. And we compared that to current trapping data. All right, so what do we expect? If the temperature is warming on mountains, we know, all of you know, here in Colorado, that it's warmer at the bottom of the mountain over the course of the year than it is at the top of the mountain. So if you were to drive up, say today, and you went skiing, you would go from warmer temperatures at the base of the mountain to the to the coldest temperatures at the top, right? It's warmer at the bottom and it gets cooler as you go higher. And as you can see here, you also similarly in Colorado get more precipitation as you go higher. So we have more snow at higher elevations. So now imagine there's a mammal that lives at mid elevations, and this is where it occurred, at these elevations shown in green before climate change. The prediction is that because species are experiencing warmer temperatures than were in their original niche, that if they're going to be tracking that temperature change, then they should be moving upward. So because temperatures warming, the same temperatures that they experienced at this elevation now might be found at this elevation. So if species are indeed tracking temperature change, then they would be expected to either shift up in elevation by having a similar span of elevations, but at higher elevations, or alternatively, they might occur across a huge span of mid to high elevations historically, and then now only occur at the top of the mountain, for instance. So that's something that we would say they contracted their range to just the highest elevations. So those are the kind of the two scenarios we might expect to happen if species are responding to climate change. Whereas if species didn't change their ranges at all, they still had this It's the same range that they had historically. We would say that population doesn't look like it's responding to climate change yet, or is not responding at all to climate change. Similarly, a species might move down in elevation or expand down in elevation. And in that case, that's not expected by climate change from temperature alone, right? Because temperatures, that would mean they're moving into areas that are warmer than they were historically. There is the caveat that there's interactions between precipitation change and temperature change. But today we're going to focus, just to be on the clearer side, to focus on temperature change. All right, so we would expect shifts up or contractions upward if species are responding as we would expect to climate change. And in this study that I'm talking about today, we spent the last 13 years studying smaller mammals. So in this case, ground squirrels. So we studied 7 species of ground squirrel. So that includes our yellow-bellied marmot, golden mantle ground squirrels, rock squirrels, desert ground squirrels, 2 tree squirrels. So the beautiful Avard squirrel, the pine squirrel, which if you've been hiking in Colorado, yells at you constantly. 4 species of chipmunk. They all look almost identical. So just one picture here. Voles. Okay, so these are things you might have never seen. So there's many voles in Colorado. 7 of them we had enough data to study. And these are small rodents that live on, particularly on grasses or plants and seeds. And then we have a lot of mice and wood rats in this state. So 13 species that we had enough data to study. And these are things like the pinyon pine or pinyon mouse and jumping mice. So famous here in the Front Range are jumping mice, wood rats, pack rats, all different types of mice. And then shrews, probably the least known among this group, are tiny little animals that eat insects. And they have really terrible vision, but they have great smell. And so here is the smallest mammal in North America. We have this mammal here in Colorado, the pygmy shrew. And then this is our water shrew, the biggest shrew, which we also studied. All right, so really charismatic, beautiful animals that we were interested in looking at on 2 mountain ranges in Colorado. So like I said before, we started working in the San Juans early in 2007, here down in the southwest corner of the state. And then the Front Range, so here's Boulder down here, Loveland up here. And these 4 transects are areas that we sampled extensively for mammal distributions. And this is Rocky Mountain National Park. This is Mesa Verde. All right, and so we had, as I mentioned, we had specimen data, and these round dots are the specimen localities that we had for each of the mountain ranges, and then the yellows are the stars, forgive me, are where we sampled contemporarily, either with other people's samples and with our trapping. And so remember, these are all museum specimen data for the historical data, and from 1886 to right before 80s, and then about 4,600 georeferenced specimens from museums all over North America. And then our contemporary data was trapping across many different years and about 7,400 specimen records where we either trap them and let them go or specimens themselves. All right, so what did we find? Overall, we found that these mammals are shifting towards higher elevations. So this is an overview slide. It's showing you all of their responses together. And so essentially it's showing you net changes in their ranges. So percent gain and minus percent loss. So where have they moved up into? So gains in elevation are shown in blue, and losses in their ranges are shown in red. And that's shown here on the maps. You can see that at low elevations, things are orange and red, meaning that ranges have been lost at those elevations. And blues are showing you that at high elevations, species are gaining range. So overall, you can see that depicted here in just counts of losses and gains. More species are gaining parts of their range at the high elevations and losing range across elevations, but mostly at the bottom half of the mountain. So the average shift upward across all of these species was 131 meters. So if you think in feet, that's 430 feet. So that's substantial change. That's about what you would expect from a 2 degree Celsius change in temperature. Of course, each of those is an individual species with an individual response. And this is a complicated slide, so I'll walk you through it. So essentially, each species name is down here, scientific name, so it's not super helpful, but their elevational range from bottom of the mountain to the top is on the y-axis, front range on top, San Juan's on the bottom. And first, just look at all of those mammals that moved up. 26 mammals moved to higher elevations. And predominantly, the biggest movers were our montane mammals. So those that occurred historically from mid-elevations to high elevations. These are the species that responded the most to climate change, and actually the most worrying responses, because 75% of our montane mammals moved higher. And their average range shift was huge, almost 350 meters higher. So remember, we're going from 1,400 meters to 3,800 meters. So 350 meters is a substantial portion of the mountain. And I'm just showing you some of the biggest movers were our yellow-bellied marmot, golden-mantled ground squirrel, a couple of our chipmunks, that adorable pygmy shrew, the western jumping mouse, another shrew, and several of our voles and mice. All right, but the thing to think about is that not everybody responded the same way, and not as we would predict with climate change. So we had 6 species that didn't change their ranges at all, and 11 actually moved to lower elevations. So either expanded their ranges downward or contracted their ranges downward. And then there's 4 important species here that actually went locally extinct, that they were in this case, very prevalent in the San Juan Mountains. Historically, we found 0, and 3 in Boulder County that were documented here at the lowest elevations, and we found 0. So these are scary cases that need more study. So locally, they've been extirpated, and they also experienced, remember this picture of Boulder County, these are the species that lived out here in the low elevations. So they've had significant habitat loss, but there's been no studies of their populations. And so they're currently unmanaged and unstudied by Boulder open space and mountain parks. And then, as I mentioned, there's this one species in Montezuma County that lives in the canyon habitats, which is not impacted very heavily by habitat change. So it's really unknown why they're declining. It could be temperature change, and it could be precipitation change in both cases, in all of these cases. So I'm mentioning habitat change, right? So you might be asking yourself, well, why isn't all of this response that you're measuring a response to habitat change? Well, many of you that have not been on these mountains might not realize, but habitat change on both mountains is very concentrated to just a short area of habitat change. It's intense habitat change, but it is not widespread. So here, the developed areas, highly developed, medium developed, low developed, and then developed open space, so things like agriculture, are shown in these red colors. And so you can see in the Front Range. This is just 2 transects, but you can see that it's concentrated at the very lowest elevations and then a little bit in the foothills. Whereas in the San Juans, it's barely perceptible here. That's because there's just very few people live in this area of the San Juans, but there is a little bit of agriculture in a few towns. But you can see that they're in the foothills as well. And that's not where we detected the majority of habitat change. I mean, a majority of range shifts. Remember, the majority of species that are shifting to higher elevations were ones that were historically at high elevations and still have moved higher. So overall, remember, our gains here are across the board, but mostly at high elevations, and that we're actually seeing losses across the board of all elevations. So there is no strong association with just loss and habitat change. And then remember, all of our sites that we were trapping contemporarily are in places that are protected, like Rocky Mountain National Park, Lizard Head Wilderness, Mesa Verde National Park, or other conservation areas. So really, we can eliminate habitat changes as the main source of the response we're measuring. And temperature is the most correlated with the response we're measuring of things moving higher. All right, but you might also be asking yourself, why are some things responding and some things not responding as we would expect? And this is a hot topic in species responses to climate change. So this is actually what a lot of scientists are asking right now. Why are we seeing some things that are responding and others that aren't? And so we tried to dig deeper into that for our data. And it turns out with our statistical models, we were able to show that the species that are moving higher the most, or a range from the least to the highest, is that those species that are more cold adapted are more sensitive and are shifting higher more often. So what do I mean by cold adapted? We're inferring that from traits and biogeography of the species. So here's just an example. This is the Western jumping mouse. This is its geographic range in brown. And you can see that here, we're in Colorado, we're at the southern end of its range. So it also occurs at high latitudes. And then the mountains we measured it in were in the southern edge of its range. And it's at mid to high elevations naturally. So what we found is that species that had high latitude ranges, or they extended from Colorado to high latitudes, and that mountains that we measured were in their southern edge of their range, and they were already montane. These are the species that shifted the most here in Colorado. And so from those traits, we infer that they're the most cold adapted, and that things that the northern, say a species that lives down here in the deserts and just makes it to the edge of the San Juans, those are the species that aren't responding as we would expect by moving up. All right, but there is some good news here, right? That some species are not responding at all, and that some are actually doing better. So we measured some species, and actually some very common species that are actually expanding their ranges downward. And that includes the most common chipmunk you see, that's the least chipmunk shown here, and the rock squirrel, and then a really beautiful vole, the red-backed vole, which is doing better both at high elevations and at lower elevations. So there are some species that are flourishing in this new climate, but a lot of species are clearly moving upward. So another thing you might be thinking is that what about those big charismatic mammals that we're famous for here in Colorado, right? Our bears, our elk, our moose, our bighorn sheep. So we didn't measure them in this study, and mainly that's because the metric of shifting up in elevation doesn't really apply to them, right? We know that bears and elk and bighorn sheep, most of these big carnivores and artiodactyls, they can go from the top of the mountain to the bottom of the mountain in 1 year, right? So they shift seasonally. They occur across all of those elevations. So they're not, if you're studying elevational change, they're not the best group to study. For them, you would study other aspects of their biology that might be changing, like population dynamics, reproductive success, effects of disease related to temperature, for instance. But in this particular study, we did not measure that. But overall, just to recap, right, we measured all of these really diverse mammals in Colorado and found that in general, they're moving upward across the board, right, by about 130 meters. But our mountain mammals are the ones that are shifting up really quite rapidly and quite dangerously by leaps and bounds. And so one of the things that's really dangerous about that is the topography of mountains, right? So here's Mount Fiji, just as an illustration, that as animals move up in elevation, there's less habitat, right? So there's less area as you get higher. And so if things are being shifted up in elevation, they're being shifted into smaller and smaller amounts of habitat, which then makes their population sizes necessarily respond by becoming smaller, and that they're then at more risk of extinction. So this is a worrying scenario for mammals in Colorado. And just to think about, you go on hikes today and see these beautiful mammals, but you want your children and your children's children to see these mammals too. And it would be horrible if someday they could not see yellow-bellied marmots, for instance, in Colorado. All right, so these are really alarming changes. There's still a lot of things that we can do because we can stop the warming from continuing on an upward trajectory. And for each individual, right, you can start small. You can take a single step, right? You can decide to do one thing and then maybe next year do a second thing. So obviously there's many things you can do, like vote. You can reuse, recycle, reduce your use of manufactured goods. You can just spread the word about what you heard today. You can fly less and hike or bike more, take the bus, and then of course embrace solar and alternative energies, because as we saw earlier, fossil fuels are really what is behind in manufacturing behind this change in CO2 in the environment. All right, so that said, that is what I had to share with you today. And I thank you so much for listening and for coming. And I hope to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Christy. That was great. As you mentioned, the study was about mammals in the Colorado Rockies, but climate change is an international issue as well. So thanks for the information and presentation. Something that I wanted to bring up for those that might not know the San Juan Mountains, I believe they're one of the most beautiful mountain ranges in Colorado. And if anybody has seen the classic Coors can that has the little mountain range on there, if you've seen that can, you've seen the San Juan Mountains. So,
I didn't know that.
They're on. If people want to, please feel free to ask any questions you have in the Q&A. One that I never quite understood, and I've been hiking plenty and I'm understanding. So if a particular species has a particular home range on a side of a mountain, and they don't migrate from the top of the mountain down to the mountain to go to another mountain, I'm just curious, how in the world do they not end up being inbred?
Yeah, so this is just about the biology of a species where it occurs. Take your yellow-bellied marmot. There's populations that are at all of these different mountains and spread across the mountain. So yellow-bellied marmots actually we think of them as only occurring at the top of the mountain, but they have really large elevational ranges. So there's actually different populations that occur all across, even here in the Front Range, that are breeding with each other. And so, but the males are the ones that disperse. So males are dispersing to other populations, whereas the females stay and they wait for new males to come in. And so they're trying to not inbreed intentionally because, of course, that has evolutionary impacts on them. So it's just a scale of population. So when we talk about their range being across the mountain, individuals don't move that far. It's actually all an aggregation of populations.
We have several questions here. I will start with Kathy Regan. How else might these animals adapt besides moving to other elevations?
Right, so there's lots of different things that you could measure about their responses to climate change. So one thing that people have been looking at about adaptation, right? You can evolve to be able to withstand different temperatures that you experienced historically. The problem now is that it's, as I mentioned, the change is happening so fast. It's happening faster than a species can evolve. And so you can adapt in place. And one of the ways you could adapt in place is by using different microclimates. So as we know, if you are a small-bodied thing, like a vole or a shrew, that's 2 grams, you can find different microclimates near the soil or in the vegetation. So you might be selectively able to use areas that are still cool enough for you to make a living, right? To eat and to reproduce and to live. But that's really not available to animals that are experiencing and can't escape into microclimates. So anything bigger than the vegetation, like a yellow-bellied marmot, a bighorn sheep. And in fact, we've found in other studies that we've done that larger mammals in North America are responding more to climate change than smaller mammals. And that's one of the ideas, is that the larger mammals just can't escape the air temperature change, whereas tiny things might be able to find microclimates.
Thank you for that. Melissa is asking, what species were extirpated locally here on the Front Range, and to what extent is it possible that they might have eluded trapping? How do you ensure that no trappings equals no species?
Right. Yeah. So if you remember, our contemporary data was our trapping data, but also we used all the specimen data since 2005. So any other researchers that had studied mammals in these 2 mountains, their data were also included. So it wasn't just our trapping, but it is a very good question, Melissa. And it's something that we want to know because there's only a few areas. So the species themselves in Boulder County are 2 pocket mice and 1 kangaroo rat. And so these are all associated with what we would term the Boulder Prairie, or the edge of the prairie where it abuts the mountains here. And they use a particular type of dry prairie. And we only have a little bit of natural dry prairie left. And so it's quite well protected. And so I've actually asked Boulder Open Space to see if we could look for them, but we're still in negotiations. But yes, it's a good question. So I want to know that too. I want to do more extensive surveys to see if we indeed can find them in the remaining remnants that exist.
I have to remember to unmute. We have several questions about pika. I will merge them into one. Were pika included in your study? What about them? Because they live so high, they can move higher. And how are they being affected?
Yeah, good question. So I forgot I was going to mention that in one of my slides, but yeah, so we didn't study pika because there was a graduate student at CU who has since graduated, Liesl Peterson Erb, and she studied them all through the state of Colorado into Wyoming and New Mexico. So she was looking at them throughout the Southern Rockies. She, in fact, found that they were doing extremely well. So they have not changed their elevational range in Colorado, and there's been very few local extirpations. So they went back specifically to known places where pika had been found pre-climate change and reassessed whether they were there. And they only found a couple places that they weren't, and then they resurveyed them a couple years later and found them. So that's another really great news story, is that pika are doing well in the Rockies. That's not true in the Sierra Nevadas and in the Great Basin ranges. They are moving up in elevation, and they are having extirpations of populations across their range, but predominantly in drier and hotter places. So pikas have a huge range, right? And this gets back to that part I said, if we're trying to study climate change responses, we have to, species have huge ranges, and we can study them in particular places, but that doesn't mean what we find here is true everywhere, because they're doing really well, say in their high latitude ranges or mid latitude ranges, but they're not doing well here in the southern part of their range. So pika in some parts of their range are doing poorly, but here in Colorado, we think it's because their range is so huge here, but also they can go down into these rock habitats and use really cooler temperatures in the summer to move up and down in what temperatures they experience under the ground. So they're a special case, and they are at risk because they are only in alpine. And as I showed before, if you move up in alpine, you quickly run out of space. So right now in Colorado, they're doing pretty good. Hopefully that continues.
Good. A comment, there's several more questions coming in, but Gina has her comment that says, I've actually seen marmots in bolder open space areas, so they don't go so high at all. Somebody is asking, sorry, that was another pika question, which you answered. Is there a corresponding shift with the vegetation that forms the diet of some of these mammals? Cullen asks.
Yeah, so most mammals are actually not very specialized in the food they eat, unlike some birds or some insects that they tend to be generalist feeders. So they might feed on they might be an herbivore feeding on all grasses or seeds, or they might be insect eaters, like all of these shrews are focusing on insects, for instance. So yes, there's locally changes in plants that are moving. We know that forests are moving as well. But in this case, we didn't measure exactly. We did measure their food resources, but we didn't link that to their change. And that's mainly because we don't have historical data on the quantity of food resources at each elevation. So we'd love to know that, but we don't know specifically about each food resource and how it's changed. But likely plants are changing, insects are changing just as much as mammals are.
Great. I think we'll probably have time for just a few more questions, and we will leave the question of the young 8-year-old who's asking for the last. So hang in there, young man, or young man, as we answer a few more. Somebody asks, is there a time of year or season when these mammals are more vulnerable that is driving this shift?
That really depends on the species. And so, but that's a great question. So some mammals overwinter in hibernation. So they're underground or in a nest, and they're kind of not experiencing the coldest temperatures. Whereas some of these tiny things, actually the tiniest things, the shrews and voles, are active all winter under the snow. And so if there's this idea that in periods of climate change, you actually die of cold in the winter. And that's because the actual snowpack, hey, sorry, my dog is making noise. The snowpack is less, and so there's less insulation. So a lot of times those shrews and voles, they need to eat to stay alive, that there's not enough insulation that they actually die of cold from climate change. But a lot of these species are actually experiencing, like the yellow-bellied marmot, really warm temperatures in the summer that influences how much they can feed, for instance. And as opposed to being under the ground is to get cool again. So it really depends on the species, each species biology.
All right. Second to last question. What similar studies have you done in other mountains?
Right, so we've been studying lichens in the San Juans for the last 5 years, and we've been studying insects here in Colorado too. But like I talked about at the very beginning, I did a lot of work in Costa Rica. And so that's one of the places we would like to go back and actually look at those Costa Rican populations and see if they've had shifts similar to what we see here in Colorado. There's a lot less research emphasis. Well, we would love to study more tropical species because obviously they're huge in their diversity, but we lack a lot of historical data for those areas. And so in this case, I did have historical data. It wasn't quite 1980, but it was really early in climate change, so 1990s. So that's another place we would like to go back and do similar study.
Great. All right. A young 8-year-old asks, what are you going to study next?
So many ideas, but yeah, so one of the things we're focusing on has been brought up in some of the questions, is looking in specific about those montane species, in particular what they might be responding to, and look at them in more general across the state instead of in these 2 mountain ranges. But another thing we're looking at is carrion beetles. So carrion beetles, we are also looking at their distributions on these mountains and how they're responding to climate change. And beetles are really cool because you can do a lot more experiments than you can with mammals, right? We can't do a lot of experimenting with the yellow-bellied marmots or the golden mantled ground squirrels, but we're looking at other systems that we can ask some of these same questions and do a little bit more experimental things to know what we say is a mechanism. So like what thermal tolerances can they live within, and how does that affect their reproduction and that kind of thing.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Christy. It's been a great evening. We are out of time, and we appreciate your time and your it was well worth the 13-year wait. So thank you for presenting tonight. We really appreciate it. I want to thank everybody for coming, and hope you have a wonderful afternoon, or sorry, evening. Take care.